Welcome to the Bureau podcast, and very happy today to have Canadian author and former national security analyst Dennis Molinaro. He's a historian as well, and he has written the book that the Bureau has reviewed 3 times now, called Under Assault. And Dennis, I'll get you to introduce yourself and how your background contributed to this deep report. But I'll tell you this. I'll tell the audience this. I was in a discussion privately with U.S. intelligence community sources recently. They had the opinion that Canada has been going a different path than the United States at the United Nations on some very key geopolitical issues recently. They asked me my opinion, and I said, yes, as a journalist expert, I'm concerned. And there's a new book called Under Assault that really lays out perhaps why there's been a divergence. So, first of all, I'll add, I see that Under Assault is #1 in Amazon in government intelligence. So congrats. Tell us about how the book's being received so far.
Thanks very much for having me, Sam. Yeah, so it's been a interesting road. So far, the book, the reception's been really good. We've, as you mentioned, it's #1. It's been in that #1 in that category actually for even before it launched on November 18th. So it's been there for a while now. So it's pretty well holding that position. And there's been moments where it was #1 across 4 or 5 categories. So it's been doing really well, and it just kind of speaks, I think, to the importance of the message, right? That people it's resonating with people, that this is something that you essentially need to read. And if you know someone who you feel needs to read it, then it's something to get them. But yeah, my background for how this developed, it's I look at the literature of what's been out in terms of Canada and China. And a lot of it is, the diplomatic history. It's kind of covering broad strokes when it comes to that side of things. The foreign interference stuff, there's been good work. You've done a great book on it. Other people have done good books on foreign interference as well. Other journalists, Joanna Chu's done work on it. There's Claws of the Panda. There's been a few. Charles Burton's new book too. His coverage is all good. His on the diplomatic side more, but there hasn't been a book that's bridged those two. And for me, that was essential, right? If we go to, think of the works of intelligence historians in the UK, who always thought you can't really understand the diplomatic unless you understand the intelligence history. And so these things are not separate. We can't just detach security from diplomacy and from relations. And so I wanted to try to tell that complete story as best I could. And it's still an ongoing telling, because there's lots of documents that are still redacted, that are still sitting in the archives that we have to get out to get the fuller picture. But that essentially was my motivation, is to try to tell as a complete picture as I could about this issue.
Yeah, and I'd encourage readers to dig into it, because it really does lay out a historical sense and up to the modern day cases. And we'll talk about in the middle here, the Winnipeg and potential Wuhan lab connection. Let's save that, but I know that's of interest internationally, and it should be. So we'll get into your perspective. But first of all, I found that you had what I would call, as a journalist, a couple, I think, bombshell scoops. Let me set it up like this. You talked to Chen Yanlin, a defected Chinese former diplomat. He defected in Australia. He told you that he had seen Chinese government files naming 2 of our prime ministers, Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, as, quote, I believe it's old friends or good old friends. So yeah. Can you explain what that means? And of course, the first file, again, the bombshell, I never knew about this person called Paul Lin out of the University of BC. You found, I believe, 900 pages or something of archival.
Oh, there's a lot.
Yeah. So, okay, let's start about what does old friends mean? And then we'll talk about Paul Lin and Pierre Trudeau.
Sure. I'll take you through all of it. So, okay. So let's go back to the beginning, if we've got the time. So, first off, when it comes to Trudeau and being influenced by China, some people have kind of, I've been even faulted for being careful, which is odd. Uh, but I've tried to be as careful as I can because of what I have and the sources that are available. Nonetheless, there's some important questions I think that have to be asked that we can't just gloss over. So, for starters, I would say that the recognition of China, I'm comfortable in saying that likely looks to me like it was a foreign interference operation by the PRC. Why do I say that? Because not necessarily having to do so much with Trudeau, but because of Paul Lin, and this is important because so Paul Lin was an academic, but he was out of McGill. He started off in the BC coast. He went to school in the States, and then he ended up going to China, and he ended up back at McGill University. And what's fascinating about him is that, one, we already knew that the CIA had a file on him. So there was some information publicly that was released years ago. There was always these rumors that he was, he was somehow involved in intelligence, or he's somehow involved with the CCP. We knew he had family ties, but that there was more than that. He even, in his memoirs, documented that he thought the RCMP was looking at him and what have you. The newspapers at the time said that they thought that he was acting as some kind of secret emissary, working both sides, Canada, China. The opposition in the House said the same thing. So there was a lot of smoke here already. Then what I got from some good releases from the archives, one was that journalists, Voice of America, as well as a Swedish journalist, were basically trying to ask about intermediaries, again, that were secretly working both sides. And this one journalist specifically mentions that Paul Lin was secretly trying to get into the Sweden where the talks were being held about PRC recognition. And he was worried that this individual was trying to influence Trudeau. But the bombshell really for me is the RCMP file, because I got a good swath of documents, about 900 pages. And that's only a fraction of his total file. There's a lot more still.
Redacted.
That spans decades, so that I haven't even gotten yet, that I'm fighting to get released. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, I got a new dump that came very recently, but there's still a lot more that could come out. So in those documents, though, we see that the RCMP not only is following him, and he's under heavy surveillance, but they also indicate that they've got intelligence, and it's redacted what they have, about his ties to the CCP, and that he was tasked by China. They mentioned that, but that's also redacted what was said there. But what's key is the redaction. The redactions are for international relationships and sharing of intelligence squad partnerships. There's a certain section of the Access to Information Act that covers that. So to me, that's an indication that this intelligence came from the United States. And so they specifically state, the RCMP, that they're warning government, they're warning about his activities, because he's going out at the time speaking broadly about the need for recognition of China. He's trying to build public support for it. And they flat out say that this is part of his task of being an agent of influence, is to get China recognized. And he does this, he goes off to do this in the US as well. And for me, that's critically important, because we also even have PRC officials talking about from a conference that was held back in 2010, where they reveal sections of their holdings, where they say that they were overjoyed with the fact that they broke a hole in America's backyard with Canada recognizing China, and that now other countries were going to copy this, and so it's a great success. And so, to me, this is an indication that obviously that China was trying to do this, and Paul Lin was central to it. He helped create the Canada-China Business Council. He gets an Order of Canada. So this is something that is hugely important, influential, I would say, going forward. And even that recognition, that cements the one China policy internationally. And yes, the UK and France recognized China before Canada, but they didn't deal with Taiwan, and they didn't deal with full diplomatic relations like as what happened after Canadian recognition. And so that's why the Canadian example stands out far more for doing this. And the ramifications of the Taiwan policy and the one China policy going forward, it's still right now today, right? As far as Trudeau, I'm a little bit more careful because I don't have the direct links, but I feel like there's enough that we need to question if he was being targeted. And I think he may have, but I don't have the sources yet uncovered to show it. But I do have enough smoke. There's smoke there that I feel that we should be asking the question if he was likely one of the first PMs targeted by China. And that's because he goes to the PRC early in his career before he's PM. He's given this ridiculously curated tour that he writes about in his book, Two Innocents in China, complete with his own works on their library shelf.
Yeah.
Now,
I
why?
noticed that in that's quite something to show a visiting young naive from Quebec, right?
Yeah, you don't do this for everybody. People had gone to China and they didn't get this kind of a tour and attempt to blatantly influence his view on the PRC. So the question is why? Well, we know that, the Soviets, the Russians, they often targeted people who they thought maybe had aspirations and were going somewhere, and essentially investing in someone early. It's completely plausible they would have done that with Pierre Trudeau. I mean, for too long, I think too many segments of the Canadian population have held up Pierre Trudeau as some kind of sacred cow that just can, that can do no wrong or has not done anything controversial or what have you. And historically, that's not the case at all. I mean, the Fantan files that I uncovered before, I mean, this now with the PRC recognition, people are complicated people, and they're three-dimensional, and we shouldn't really mythologize, I think, anyone.
Yeah, that on that point, do you think broadly, just jumping out of the intelligence files, your work among others is, encouraging a fresh look at the ongoing influence of Pierre Trudeau and his ideologies on Canada's direction? I'm asking because I do think when I talk to Americans and they say, it seems Canada and the United States are separating at the United Nations, and I
Mm.
say, well, Trudeau Senior could be seen as influential in that, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, it's the influence of that Canadian administration, that Canadian government, during his time was substantial because really it established a type of view of Canadian nationalism that's kind of percolated through English Canada ever since, and one that's kind of more supplanted the old British view of that English Canadian nationalism. One that is really tied to these types of mythologies, whether it's, like Canada is a peacekeeping nation. Well, peacekeeping was established during the Cold War to assist in the Cold War, uh, you know, battle between the Soviets and the Americans, and Canada was firmly in the American camp. It wasn't to peacekeeping was not peacemaking, and so, but these kinds of mythologies were kind of created really and promoted, I would say, under that. And why? There was a response. Essentially, it was an anti-Americanism response that was going on, from the period of the Vietnam War. But this kind of view of Canada that really kind of got pushed on from Pierre Trudeau Senior's time has really lingered, and it's lingered in pockets really in the older population,
Hmm.
but not so much, percolating down through the generations. I mean, they're much more open to the ideas that history is complicated. These characters need a second look, and there's a lot of stuff that's still sitting buried in our archives and our historical institutions that we have to get out.
Right. So I don't want to forget to have you address old friends of Beijing.
Oh
So
yes, yes, yes,
what
yes.
did
So
you
let's
learn from
let's
Chen Yon Lin on two Canadian prime ministers found classified, by
yeah.
the way?
So he was looking at. He told me he was looking at this file on oceanic affairs, and he came across three names. He came across Henry Kissinger, he came across Pierre Trudeau Senior, and he came across Jean Chrétien.
Wow.
And all were categorized as old friends, as he put it. So I asked him, okay, what does old friends mean? And he basically said that these are people. It's a terminology that the CCP uses, and it's a friend can be really a more on a superficial level. They're not really, they could kind of come and go. They're not really deeply held. But old friends, he said, is different. It's this category of an individual that is very close to the PRC in supporting. So the CCP, though primarily not necessarily Chinese people, but the CCP views as a close ally in a sense, and it could be for a number of reasons. I mean, who knows? But um, China has come out actually and publicly called Chrétien this during his last visit. I think that was a couple of years ago now. It happened when I was actually writing the book. I thought timing was perfect. So, but he went over there, and they referred to him as an old friend, and they did it for Kissinger as well in his last few years of his life. So I presume they probably would have said the same thing publicly about Pierre Trudeau. But it's important because it establishes this kind of close tie that the leaders have with the PRC. And what's interesting about their terminology of old friends, it's not tied to one leader, right? Like we could see in the Western sense, um, Reagan and Mulrooney. Maybe they were close friends or what have you. But this phrasing that the PRC uses, this type of categorization, obviously the leader doesn't stay, but the party does, and so it's a person who they value even generations later, which is quite a substantial thing, I would say.
Right. Another thing that I learned a lot, I've been following myself, the Canada-China Business Council and related entities, Power Corporation. In my own book and some of my reporting, I've noted as well that Power Corporation, the Desmarais family, Jean Chrétien, can be connected in investment relationships to senior Chinese Communist sort of foreign investment bodies, which is interesting in itself. But I learned from your book, Canada-China Business Council was started by this academic, Paul Lin, who, as you write, again, in your files, the RCMP strongly suggest, if not overtly say, he's believed to be a Chinese influence agent. So I found that, I mean, when I look at, and you write that the Canada-China Business Council and Mr. Lin sort of curated access to China's internal industries for Canadian elites to invest in. So if I'm right about that, can you kind of unpack that? Because I found it stunning.
So I don't have much on the Canada-China Business Council going forward, but I do have that he was, obviously he was one of the influential people that helped start it, right? And Desmarais family, I think, was part of that as well, I think, if I'm correct. So yeah, what happens is in the 70s, the RCMP notes that basically in the later 70s that he's using, once China opens up and it has that recognitions established, people then are going to Paul Lin to get business deals in China. So he's acting as this intermediary that's taking business leaders over to China, and he's bringing them over, right? So I don't have the files, but I am curious to know if well, essentially that's kind of where the formations of the Canada-China Business Council originate from. This kind of bringing people over to do business, what have you. So, but the problem becomes Paul Lin, right? The problem is it's this guy. His central interests were the CCP, and so it could vary. Obviously, today very different. Obviously its own foundation and doing totally legitimate business, nothing nefarious. But it's the early origin here with Paul Lin that's the problem, because it brings into all kinds of, for me, it brings into all kinds of questions. Mainly if the government's getting briefed on this guy, PCO is getting briefed on him. Presumably, then the prime ministers would know about Paul Lin. What was done about this? Why was this guy continuing to live the kind of life that he was living, which was pretty wealthy, regarded as like royalty in China? So why is he being able to carry on like this? And what is being done about it? It just raises all kinds of uncomfortable questions about that people are essentially being briefed about this guy and his activities, but they don't seem to want to do anything, just look the other way, and he gets high profile Canadian recognition later.
All right, before we move into Winnipeg and Wuhan, I mean, on that point, as a historian, do you think that sort of the business influence around, you name a number of Canadian prime ministers sort of that circulate around that Canada-China Business Council. Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, Jacques Chrétien, Paul Martin, and then, the business relationships are in that body. So do you think that's been influential in what you detail as something, an assault on Canada?
Well, the Damaris family is what they're primarily, those PMs are primarily wrapped up in, right? They have different connections to that family and to the business of Power Corp. Um, and I think it's influential because, it kind of is I think what goes on essentially back in those days is, the business community is looking for inroads into China, and the politicians are the gatekeepers, right? In some sense, that if they can open up the doors, then it's more business. The problem is that, you know um, the PRC uses those connections as vectors for malign influence. I mean, that's where they target it. So, really, I think what goes on is and what, or at least what went on, was this idea of, seeing China the way they wanted to see it. That they had rose-colored glasses on, and the U.S. did the same thing after Tiananmen Square in the '90s. They had the same kind of view that this was, um, you're going to get rich in China, and by doing this kind of business, and they all just kind of flock there. And it's a way of, it's that's why I use that comparison, with Robert McNamara, when he makes that statement that, belief and seeing are both often wrong, and we see what we want to believe, right? That just fit perfectly for me to explain that those kinds of relationships that they go over, and they're just seeing China as they want to see it and the potential, but they're completely ignoring, and they don't see the security as an actual threat when it's the major threat.
Right. So let's jump into Wuhan and Winnipeg. You raised the question. I want to have you unpack your research, because
Sure.
this is quite the rabbit hole. I've
Yeah,
written,
it is.
I mean, I've written enough about it at the Bureau, again, all based on the documents that had to be pried out of Justin Trudeau's Liberal government with a lawsuit in Parliament. There was also a lot of open source records in academic papers, and you've been through that and more. So, I mean, I just think this case probably should still be of interest to people of the
Yep.
world, and yet I still see it classified as a wild conspiracy. So,
Yep.
I mean, unpack
Yep.
that chapter. Tell it the
Sure.
way you want to tell it.
Well, so here's the thing. I mean, that for me, the Winnipeg Lab incident really kind of capped off that chapter so well, because it was all about, that entire chapter was about, you know, Canada being this place where the PRC is just actively somehow operating and doing it as it will, um, and Canada just being totally naive and blind to the actual realities. So what is it? I mean, you have these two Canadian researchers that are, with historically tied to China ancestrally, and they, the one is, she's applying for 1,000 talent plans. She's working in the top secret lab in Winnipeg. She's applying to do these, the 1,000 talent plans. Essentially, this is PRC money funding academics, with the goal of acquiring their IP. So she's doing all these applications to go there. She's going on speaking tours. The PRC wants her to help them set up this new Wuhan secret lab. And goes over there, does work with the Batwoman, as she's nicknamed, another researcher with ties to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and artificially evolving viruses, the gain of function research, which is a dangerous practice, because you are artificially evolving a virus to infect people that normally wouldn't. Now, the goal in the end is usually to develop a vaccine for that, but it's dangerous because these viruses are being scaled up quickly and artificially, and she's doing it to coronaviruses. So she's doing this
Dr.
work.
Shi, you mean, or the Canadian doctor?
Yes, no,
Dr.
Dr. Shi, right? Yeah, she's doing this with coronaviruses now. So And how do we know all this stuff? We know this stuff because the Americans were funding a portion of the activities that were going on in that Wuhan lab. And part of the reason for funding labs like this is so you know what's going on. So there's a little bit of an intelligence collection mechanism that's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're concerned about these types of research and this type of activity. The Canadian scientists started sending over Ebola samples to the Wuhan lab when they request them because it doesn't have them. And so, and the capper for me at this was she gets approved. She does some work in the Wuhan lab when she goes there. From what I understood, when she visited, she gave a conference or a talk there. And then in 2019, she's approved along with Dr. Shi to run this, presumed, I believe it was Dr. Shi, I think it was redacted, but presuming because it's just, they worked together and the description fit. And so she's approved to run this gain of function research. The documents that I have don't specifically say gain of function research. They say it sounds like gain of function. I call it gain of function research because the description of the project was to artificially evolve viruses, which is gain of function research. So for me, that's pretty clear.
They called it a bat filovirus project. I remember the redacted documents. So
yeah, and it mentioned about evolving it. So that's gain of function. I mean, that's pretty well that fits the description. So that to me is close enough that seems plausible of what it is. And we don't know if it took place, but they were approved to start running this. But what we do know is a few months later, COVID breaks out. And China destroys all the early samples. So we have no way of really tying the origins of the virus. But again, it raises the very uncomfortable questions of, if the lab leak is ever confirmed, did this Canadian researcher have a role in this? And the lab leak, I don't see this as conspiracy at all. I mean, I see this as probably more likely than having a virus that emerges so fast, basically overnight, that can infect humans on scale, just on a mass scale. I mean, that is the actual more unbelievable aspect. Because even SARS, could spread and what have you, but it wasn't, these viruses didn't move this quickly. This quick moving suggests that there was, adapted to humans in some capacity. But there's enough, I mean, from the Americans to suggest that they still are theorizing. I mean, CIA's most recent report was low confidence that it was a lab leak, but other ones were not so low. So, I mean, ultimately, I don't think we're going to get the full story unless somehow we get more documents that are released. But
right, yeah. So I'll underline that. From my understanding, German intelligence says it's more likely than not that it leaked from the lab. British intelligence, I mean, Boris Johnson spoke to his early knowledge that British judged more likely from the lab. FBI, even higher confidence than the CIA. I think, American Center for Disease Control early on was saying it's spreading too fast to be, from a wet market. So yeah, if I can do anything with this podcast, it'll be, here we have a Canadian expert saying, yeah, let's look at the sources. This is not a wild conspiracy theory. It's not proven, but it's right.
Yeah. I mean, Elaine Dewar's book was a great insight into this as to why it's not a lab leak is a conspiracy. I mean, if you're on the fence and you think that it's a conspiracy, read her book. I mean, it's all facted. It's all it's pretty lays it up pretty clearly that they did a lot of work in the early days to try to cover this up.
Right. So I want to jump into your final chapters where you go right to U.S. government sources and ask them how they view Canada. But before we do that, because before I ask you that question, and I'll read a quote, which is stunning, I think, but I wanted to touch this. You also covered how Dr. Chu from Canada, I believe, was working with CanSino, the PLA
Yeah.
linked company that worked on a vaccine with Canada. So there's a lot going on there. We never got the vaccine, but I mean, I reported on it as well. Dr. Chu was working with a senior PLA general on Ebola counter or whatever they were doing.
Yeah.
She was sending, I also wanted to mention, the documents say she was sending mice or guinea pig adapted materials from the Winnipeg lab, some of them to do with, I believe, Nipah and Ebola. So, no,
Mhm.
let me just ask you this. Do we know all that's come out of the Winnipeg lab, or are redactions still in the way of knowing?
I think we know most of it. I think. I mean, I don't know because I know as much as you in terms of everything that there is that's redacted. Um, but I think we know enough. Like, I mean, like we're probably missing like those few details, like I said, where there's people that are, the names of some of the people that she's working with are redacted, but at the same time, there's descriptions of them, so it's kind of like, well, you can kind of figure, you can kind of guesstimate essentially what's in that redaction. I mean, that's what I had to do in certain segments because I just don't know. So I have to just kind of piece together based on how they describe things and this person's experience, and then and what have you. Um, but it's, I think from our side there's quite a bit there that's out that looks, enough that I felt I could tell a pretty, coherent narrative here. But in terms of, it's what happens over there, what happened over there when she did this research and when she was going to do other research, and that's the missing link that I guess we're probably not going to ever have.
Right. Okay, so we'll jump into the final section here, and we'll get your recommendations for what needs to improve. But
Sure.
I'll set you up like this. I'm going to read, your one of your final chapters says you went to
Yep.
some U.S. Sources and asked them how do they view their northern neighbor when it comes to PRC foreign interference. And this is what you say. You got a quote, "I don't want to say joke," one American official told you, but the saying you get a lot of times here is, "Look to Canada if you want to see what could happen here." In other words, how bad it could get in the United States. Another one told
Yeah.
you, they gave you a blunt assessment. Canada is overrun. I know some of the people I work with in the malign influence space say Canada is trying to stay afloat. So you also sort
Yeah.
of compare the recent, the Hogue Commission and the NSI COP report, which I don't want to forget. But let me start by asking you, why did you go to the US sort of community sources and what did they tell you?
It seemed like an obvious place I needed to go. Mainly because, as you read the book, you'll see every chapter there's dealing with the United States and things that are happening in the United States and the United States' response to things, and sometimes there's cross border incidents that occur. Like Subin was one of those things, and so there's a lot of this back and forth with America throughout the book. So I mean, while it's the topic is centered in Canada, it's certainly more of a North American than anything else title, but. So that led to an obvious kind of place to go for me was, well, what do the Americans think of all this, right? So I got connected to people that work directly in that space, that were close to policymakers and lawmakers, pretty close, I would say. And yeah, and so I try to, I mean, there's so much only you can extrapolate from the people that I talk to, the number of people that I talk to, but at the same time, what I was really after was kind of what is the sentiment, what's the culture, what are you hearing amongst the community over there, and this is what they told, what you read out, and that is very problematic. That's a big problem, and it's a big problem because this, as you know, and as other people know who've written books, you write them and then it takes time for them to come out and, through the whole process that it takes to get it out the door. So these were officials that I interviewed during the Biden years, the so-called friendlier administration to Canada. And what it suggests is that there's a long-standing view that they have, right? This doesn't just emerge. This kind of a perception is formed over time and over years. And it's a big problem, especially when the one said that they feel that they're starting to reevaluate kind of the trust with Canada because of it. Now that's important because that's saying that what they were trying to essentially say as nice as possible was we're going to have to start thinking about how we share intelligence with you if you don't clean up your PRC problem. It's basically kind of what the gist of it is, what I got. And that's a big problem. Canada is a very dependent, it's partner in the Five Eyes relationship. I mean, there's some things it leads on in different areas, but it's overwhelmingly still very dependent. And that's not, people kind of want to have this kind of view of Canada right now because of troubles with the United States of, just who cares and what have you. Yeah, no, you don't understand. And the people who work in those areas understand, and they understand the importance of maintaining a good relationship and how much Canada is dependent on that relationship. And so this is a serious problem if the Americans have this perception of us, because look, we talk about, even if you talk about tariffs and trade problems right now, if the Americans really wanted to, and to take an even harder line with Canada, they could tie the trade relationship to the PRC relationship. They could say, well, you're looking for, more trade with China, and you have this PRC influence problem. We're going to scale back our partnership with you on trade and other issues until you move away from them. They could do that. I mean, it's within the realm of possibility, and then it causes further problems for Canada.
So this is something I covered in my book. I got the sense from talking to government sources in British Columbia from the American government that they were quite active in British Columbia specifically because they had concerns that Chinese international corruption, crime, and I think state networks were so present that the US government felt it had to be in there to protect its interests. And this is before fentanyl was a huge issue. I mean, I knew it was an issue when I wrote the book, but I kind of get I wrote in my book, if Canada, let's put it this way, if Canada can't take care of issues in its own backyard, it's going to give away some sovereignty to our natural ally, the United States, which I think is what you're pointing to. They're not going to let fentanyl, potentially Chinese state operations like Su Bin, you mentioned, targeting like F-35 technology or things of that nature. Run out of Vancouver. So I think I agree with you on that. I heard another person say very recently, talking to people in the US, maybe in the same way you did, that they're starting to see Canada as a sort of, as they put it, a semi-domestic concern. And what I take from that, it's very alarming for Canadians. They're thinking about, they might need to project American security into Canada more because the threats emerging from Canada are becoming real, which is, I mean, can you speak to that at all?
I mean, I haven't heard that, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me because the Americans are known internationally for protecting their interests wherever their interests lie. And I think they expect this is something that doesn't get enough attention because the NATO conversation, the NATO funding issues suck up a lot of the oxygen when it comes to Canada, picking up the slack when it comes to the relationship with the United States. But the internal security issue is one of those issues that has grown more in importance because it's gotten so bad. At least that's the perception that they have, and I think that there's some true. When I'm doing this book and I'm looking at 50 years worth of all this activity, and we still don't have a foreign agent registry. Even though we've passed a law to create one, we still don't have anyone prosecuted under any foreign influence laws, even though we have new laws to target them. Then you have, they, from their perspective, they start to see it as, well, either, you're unwilling or you're incapable of trying to address and target this problem. And that's it. That's a major issue.
Right. So we'll finish up with this. We'll get your recommendations, but before that, I mean, I wanted to get your comments. You looked at the Hogue Commission's final findings and
Yep.
NSI Cop's final findings. So where were they the same and where were they different? And if you could say which one was the better set of findings.
Well, it's interesting because in the fact finding portion, I felt that the NSI COP's, which wasn't out yet, final report, when it does emerge, is more in line with the fact finding conclusions of the Hogue inquiry. I mean, they seem to kind of gel in certain spots. I mean, in terms of discussing the severity of the threat and what have you. Where things get weird is in the second half, for me at least, where they all of a sudden the Hogue inquiry, when it comes to, and this is the part where it comes to the procedures and how things, the policy, the sharing of intelligence and using all that kind of stuff, the policy side. In other words, the side where blame needs to be ascribed. So that side, that half of the inquiry seems to have all these conclusions that, well, things just get misplaced, and there was I think, I can't remember the actual phrasing they used for the NSI COP report, of something like problematic or behavior. Problematic. I mean, the NSI COP report is talking about politicians, I think it mentioned, that met overseas with foreign intelligence officers. It was, some of the scenarios they described were, and they said, use the word witting, which was horrible. They never used the word treasonous. I mean, that came out in the press, but that wasn't the phrasing that they used. So I thought they were being pretty, transparent, as much as I never would have expected that kind of level of transparency, but they were giving a really transparent, forthright not even just recommendations, but analysis of the situation. Whereas in the Hogue inquiry, the second half just seemed to be, to me, focused on ascribing, not really trying to blame anyone, that this just kind of happened the way it happened. And that didn't sit well with me, but it fed directly into the narrative and into the analysis that I was putting forward, which was, again, and you see it in the testimony of people at the inquiry, that I truly think they believed there wasn't a problem because they didn't see China as a problem, and they didn't see the activities of the PRC as a problem. And so that kind of reinforced to me, I had that portion of, I had most of the book already written, and I was just kind of waiting for the final report done. And when it came out, the fact that it didn't really disagree largely from my finding in terms of Canada seeing and believing what it wanted to when it comes to the PRC, for me, was just proof that I was right.
That's, I mean, an amazing way to put it. The through line of your 50 years of research, the Hogue Commission's final finding, you are suggesting fit in with that kind of seeing China the way Canada's elite wanted to see it.
Yeah, it seemed that it just, that the testimony of Trudeau and the testimony of other people in the inquiry, it overwhelmingly kind of proved my point. And the point that I had made even before it came out, it hadn't come out yet. I had already written the book, and I was waiting to add to it because I wanted to save space. And then that came out. Okay, well, it just cements it, really.
Right. Okay. So what do we need to do to improve? And let me put it this way, because
Sure.
I get asked the question a lot.
Yeah.
Could it be too late for Canada? And I can't discount the possibility that, from my own view, having covered this stuff for probably about 10 years now, if
Right.
Canada doesn't take some very firm measures and quickly, urgently, meaning, within the next couple year or two, it we we could be in the position of losing sovereignty. And as I say,
Yeah.
potentially to Western allies who
Right.
so that's my alarming. I don't say that's going to happen, but that's a low possibility in my mind.
Yeah, I think that that threat is real. I think that that needs to strongly be considered. Um, and okay, for in terms of recommendations, I've got a lot and I'm hard pressed to find anyone who's going to disagree with them, because they're pretty, I would say, in line with what a lot of people have been saying for years. Pick up the slack when it comes to funding your own defense. This is a no-brainer. You can't claim to, you want more. You're being more aggressive in the international stage with allies, okay, with the United States because of the disagreements with the Trump administration. But at the same time, if you're not going to spend any money on your defense and your own military, well, that has to start. I mean, that's been a critique that's been going on from experts for a long time, that Canada has to pick up the slack there. But funding is only part of the problem, and that's the issue that I keep, that's what I keep kind of trying to demonstrate too, and even with my recommendations, is that funding is only a small part of the problem. The bigger problems are the ones that are the harder. It's the culture that has to change. One, we need RICO-style laws. We need those. You can't target the bosses if your laws are centered on targeting the individual acts that members of these criminal organizations do. If they're targeted in this way, then you're not going to get the people at the top. You need a structure of laws that will target the people who are running these organizations, and tie them to the individual offenses, like the Americans are doing. If you're not going to do that, which seems to me the most easiest, obvious thing to add to your criminal code legislation, if there's a reluctance to do it, then there's a reluctance to go after these organizations and their leaders. And then we get into why. So that's one thing. But I mean,
And
there's other issues too.
before
Yeah,
we
go
move
ahead.
on, because people that follow the Bureau know I write about RICO and
Yep.
anti-racketeering laws, but something you cover in your final chapter, I think, really illuminates that. You say the Canadian government is now treating Indian diplomats and
Right.
alleged connections to transnational organized crime as a terror threat and as
Hmm.
a real entity to target. And you're saying, but there seems to be a double standard. You
There
even
is.
point to a few cases where it looks like China and others are using those same networks. So maybe to your RICO point, can you unpack how that would work?
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the inquiry, right? In the Hogue inquiry, they had made a statement. The RCMP made a statement that they had information that I can't remember how they put it exactly. I mean, but it's in the book, where there was money laundering that was tied, it's connected to foreign interference, by the PRC, something like that along those lines. But they made the decision not to go after them because new networks would just get created. Well, huh?
Yeah.
How does that? There's so much crime, we just can't police the crime. I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like. So it was, maybe it was just poorly phrased on their part. I don't know, but it just didn't sit well with me, particularly because we saw how aggressive the government went after India. And so, even though repeatedly CSIS had put out in its public reports that the PRC is the number one state threat actor. So if we see all these activities that India has been doing, and they're number two, well, good God, what does number one look like? I mean, how is that possible? How is it possible if that's number two, or even number three, or what have you, and we have next to nothing discussed in terms of what the number one threat does when it comes to these kinds of networks, even though it's been admitted in the inquiry that there's connections, and we see these connections in other countries, in the United States, in Italy, and in Europe. They talk about the criminal connections, but in Canada, it's just silence for the most part.
Even Australia, I don't know if you saw the recent
Yeah.
Radio Canada report. They're saying a Chinese secret police agent disclosed.
Yes. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Right. And they connected this agent to a US Treasury sanctioned transnational crime group in Cambodia. And the question of this story is whether a dissident in Vancouver who died in a kayaking accident. I mean, Radio Canada, the French side of CBC, came out with a text saying that China wanted this guy gone, right? So
Yep.
I'm just trying to underline that you're pointing to China seems to be involved in some of the same stuff that India is.
Yeah, well, Yanglin Shen, the defector, had put it to me. I asked him, point blank, does China engage in assassinations abroad? He said yes, they do. He said that it's rare, it's not as common, but they do it. So it's not as if it's outside of the realm of their capability or what they do. And so again, I mean that's one section of the laws that, in terms of legal changes that we need to go after the top heads of these organizations. But that's far from it. I mean, culturally, we have an issue here in Canada when it comes to sharing on these types of files. I mean, between our law enforcement and our intelligence community, it's classic, intelligence to evidence scenario. But that comes, in my opinion, from the way we've divvied up our services, where we have one side that collects intelligence and uses methods and tradecraft, what have you, that can't be entered into court. And we have another side that doesn't collect intelligence, that just does law enforcement and evidence-based collection. And that's, again, you can point back to the Trudeau Senior for this. And the separation of these two entities that don't speak to each other. And only recently have gotten better over the last 20 years when it comes to counterterrorism. But on the CI side, I guess, the counterintelligence side, my only assumption is that we're not doing a good enough job of getting evidence, intelligence into courts. I mean, we saw the book talks about one case that just fell apart because they couldn't get the intelligence into the courtroom. So there's a problem there, and that's culturally, that's deep rooted in the structure of our organizations and how they've been created. Maybe the solution then is to have, as I propose in the book, to have the RCMP take on counterintelligence, counterterrorism, be able to collect intelligence. How you want to structure that, if it's a new organization or if it's just a completely revamped one. And then you have CSIS take on the foreign collection and have a foreign service, which it's about time we should be doing that anyways if we actually want to be serious about our own independence and sovereignty in the world. Then why are we relying on other states for foreign intelligence collection? We should have a human intelligence service of our own. So there's a National Security Council. We had that created, but it doesn't meet regularly. It's still kind of on the whim of the PM. Ultimately, if you ask me, a lot of this stuff falls to having good leadership. If you don't have good leadership that's going to take the lead on these things and grab it, take it by the hand and run it through and solve them, don't expect any changes.
So it's going to be a heavy lift, and you're going to need tone at the top. You're going to need a prime minister that
100%.
that is going to do some very hard work and make people mad if it's going to happen, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you notice that all of these recommendations, none of them come with new powers, so to speak. I mean, a lot of these are structural errors. These are things that need to be fixed culturally in this country. We don't have an intelligence culture in this country. That's another thing. In terms of, we're not like the United States, not like the UK, not like Australia. That's completely absent here. So that's another issue, a whole other issue. But there's so many things that need to be addressed and fixed that are well outside of the last thing, which is a more power. Because if you have problems sharing even right now, let's say if there's issues with sharing, I mean, your work, I think I've seen covering problems with sharing with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you have new powers doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have some kind of epiphany about sharing. Like, that doesn't, those things don't line up. So if you're not sharing now, you're not sharing later. I mean, that's just how it's going to work. So there has to be some type of change culturally, structurally, that happens to get at all these underlying issues that have kind of plagued have allowed this kind of problem to continue for as long as it has.
And it sounds like it'll be political and perhaps driven by a younger
100%.
generation. So along
Yeah.
that point, I mean, where can people find your book and what's next for you in this line?
You can find it pretty well everywhere. I mean, it's all major bookstores, independent bookstores carry it. Amazon carries it. Indigo carries it in the United States. Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, all the usual ones. So yeah, it's I got a copy here. There it is.
There
Pick
it
it
is.
up, and it's, if like I said, it's essential reading not only for people who are interested in this topic, but I find that it's the people who don't know enough about this topic who should be reading it. So if you know someone who fits that bill, definitely consider picking that up and toss it in the stocking for them.
Put it on
But yeah,
your elbows up, neighbor. Stocking
yeah,
stuffer.
100%. Look, if we're gonna have, if people want to talk elbows up, we should be having elbows up when it comes to China too.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be allowing a foreign state to kind of do the kinds of activities that they've been doing here. Within our communities, within our elections, with our people, and for as long as they've been doing it unchecked, that's got to stop.
Right. Okay, Dennis, we've covered a lot. Thanks so much for your time. And I too, I recommend this book as a fellow Canadian author that's written on these subjects. I learned a tremendous deal, and an enjoyable read. So thanks
Thank you.
again, Dennis.